Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 36. I recently spoke with Stephen Mirassou of Stephen Kent Winery at his tasting room in Livermore. Stephen is the sixth generation in his family to make wine. They trace their California wine roots all the way back to the Pellier brothers in the 1850s. We mentioned the Pellier brothers briefly in episode 24 on Fremont wine history. We discuss his family, how he made his way back into wine, living and making wine in Livermore, its vineyards, and of course, Cabernet Franc. I hope you enjoy. Here we go. You kind of grew up in the wine industry a bit, huh? Your family goes a ways back.
We go a ways back. Yeah, I think I started working at the winery when I was 11 or 12 years old, something along those lines. Working in the summers. I lived in South San Jose in Almaden. The winery was probably 20 minutes away in the east side in Evergreen.
Okay.
And I would ride in with a guy who worked in the marketing department at Mirassou, and then I would spend the day on the bottling line or working in warehouses or disgorging champagne, sparkling wine, and then come back home. And was always really fun to sort of be in the environment, to see a lot of what the family did and had been doing for, now it's almost 170 years. In fact, this is 170-year anniversary this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I wish I had known then what it was like to harvest fruit and make wine. We were always back in school before harvest started.
Okay.
And it would have changed my life. There's no question about it. It's the greatest job in the world now is to make wine. I didn't know that at the time. So I went to school on the East Coast and studied literature, wanted to teach, wanted to write books, got back in the family business when I came back to California with my wife, my first wife, and a couple of our kids at that point. But the wine business is the production end of the business is the absolute most thrilling thing that there is.
Did you feel any pressure to get into the family business?
Sort of the opposite of that.
Okay.
Really. I'm the sixth generation of the family in the business in California. And my father was the VP of sales for the company for Mirassou. And he was gone 2-3 weeks out of each month during the course of the year. I didn't see him a lot growing up.
Okay.
And there was never really any expectation necessarily that I would work for the winery as an adult. There really weren't roads built by the family members at that time for succeeding generations. So it wasn't really a thing to really even contemplate. And again, part of the challenge for me was I didn't live near the winery. So I didn't like my cousins did, where they could just walk to the winery and they were there all year round. In certain ways, it was a blessing, to have experienced a lot of different things in Washington, D.C. and New York, where I went to school. And then to come back into the business as an adult and understand really kind of what it means, maybe more authentically in a way, or to come to it more personally, to be certain.
Yeah, sort of coming back by your own choice.
Indeed, as opposed to sort of this is what every generation of the family does. That was never a thing at Mirassou.
Okay.
There was the idea that each generation would get involved in a different part of the business. My grandfather and great uncle owned the vineyards, owned the winery. They were not into the production end. They were just they were the owners, basically. And then my father's generation were the guys who marketed the Mirassou name, who made the wines, that kind of thing. And then my generation never really got involved much because the brand was sold kind of when we were of that age.
Right. Okay. You went to NYU, and was it George Washington?
George Washington as an undergrad and NYU as a grad student.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so literature?
Yes. You ask it so questioningly. Yes. Not what I first thought I would be doing. I thought I would go to law school when I went to GW. Being able to go to school in DC and live 3 blocks from the White House is an amazing experience. I was an 8th grader doing that middle school trip with some friends. And my first experience on the East Coast, it was amazing. And I think I knew even then that I wanted to go to school on the East Coast. My family had been Santa Clara County people for generations, and none ever seemed to leave. And it seemed to me that the right thing to do was to experience something different. I didn't expect to get married to somebody from out there necessarily when I was out there, but loved the idea of, kind of following that trail. When you're on that trip, you go from Jamestown to Philadelphia to DC to New York. And I went to NYU after graduating from GW and figured that I would get my master's and my PhD and go on to teach. Got my master's, was working full time doing non-literature related stuff, and just I couldn't see 3 more years at that point in my life. So went off and did other things until I got back to California.
And moving back to California, was that triggered by you wanting to get back into the wine business, or did that come after you moved back and sort of saw it around you a little more, maybe? Or?
The wine thing was not an impetus at all. Okay. I was married. My late wife, my first wife, who's no longer living. We met as freshmen at GW. We got married after we graduated. And actually, after I got my master's, and we had a couple of kids, one on the way. I wanted for my parents to sort of see the kids growing up for a while. The plan was to go back to California for a few years and then go to the East Coast again, where my wife's family is from. Nobody goes back to New Jersey after being in California. It just is. It's not. I think I knew that maybe. But we had a couple more kids when we were in California, and I was working for small family companies doing outdoor maintenance stuff and managing street sweeping contracts is actually what I did, until there was an opportunity to help manage part of a new wine brand that my dad had started after he left the family business, and got in kind of on the sales side, which is what he did. And that's kind of my introduction to, as an adult, to the business, was flinging a bag of samples on my shoulder and walking from store to store kind of a thing.
That's the Yvan Tomas?
Yvan Tomas, exactly.
Okay.
And when I started in January of 96, we contemplated and quickly got into building the Stephen Kent brand, which was a mission for us to try to prove that you could make world-class Cabernet from Livermore. So we wanted to make one wine, one cab, expensive cab for the place and for the time, which we did. And I got into really actually into the cellar and really into the production end of things probably with the 99, 2000 vintage.
Okay.
And then from that point forward, it was, that's what I did most of the time and went out and sold when I wasn't in the cellar making wine.
And that was a Cabernet Sauvignon?
Cabernet Sauvignon was to start, and then we did some Chardonnay. The vineyard we got our first fruit from was a 9-acre vineyard, half and half Cab and Chard. Vineyard doesn't exist in Livermore anymore. It was kind of run into the ground, unfortunately, by one of the next owners of the site. And got into doing a bunch more varieties. Started wine clubs in the early 2000s as a way of staying in business after 9/11, which really hurt the high-end wine business quite a bit. So we were making Barbera and Sangiovese. We were making Syrah, Petit Syrah, Grenache, and several different vineyards worth of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc. And that was kind of how we grew in the valley, was just acquiring fruit from a bunch of different really great sites and creating a portfolio for ourselves of wines that people seem to enjoy.
What made you start to lean into the Cabernet Franc?
Experiencing Loire Valley wines in the early 2000s, going to Kermit Lynch Wine Shop really was kind of the nexus for me in Berkeley in 2001, 2002, that kind of time frame. I had always, especially kind of leading up to 1996 when I started with my dad, I took like all of 95 to reading, tasting, writing, thinking a lot about wine. Knew in 95 that I eventually would, in 96 was going to start with the business, wanted to have as much knowledge as I could glean, working full time at this other stuff as well. But tasting those wines from Chinon, tasting the wines from Bourgogne and Semur Champagny, and just sort of being hit in the gut with just how pure these wines were, how beautiful they were, how mysterious they were, what they revealed and what they hid in important ways, I thought, attracted me to the grape. Obviously, different growing areas. But we started, I think the first vintage of Cab Franc that we made that was 100% Cab Franc was 2005 from Guilmette Vineyard, which became our primary fruit source after acquiring partners in the business. But it really kind of goes back to the early 2000s and a region that still holds me in thrall at this point in time.
That the Guilmette Vineyard seems really close to your heart from the book. Tell me a little more about that vineyard.
A vineyard planted in 1999, 2000 by a group of Napa planters, really good at their job. And the vineyard was planted, it's 64 acres of vines on a 100-acre site in the eastern foothills of Livermore. Planted because it was in a conservation area, and planted because the owners of the vineyard had built a country club, Ruby Hill Country Club in Livermore. So they had to mitigate the planting or the growing or the building of houses by growing a certain number of acres, planting a certain number of acres. We got together because they were looking to decide whether they wanted to create their own brand, and I was looking for investors in a stable fruit source for Stephen Kent, which was at that point in time, this is 2005, 2004, 2005, I was sort of already kind of seen, I think, as a real high-end brand making small quantities of really good wine. And this was a gorgeous site that really is, I think, a bellwether for how great Livermore Valley can be. It's a cold site. People are under this misapprehension that Livermore is a really hot place. It can get warm during the day. But because of the way the valley is situated and all the cold air that comes in from San Francisco Bay every afternoon, in the evening it's very cold. And so this vineyard buds out last in the springtime, harvest last in the fall, and the Bordeaux varieties grow really, really well there. It was a site that I managed for the partnership, the Guilmette family and me and Stephen Kent Winery.
Okay.
And I actually moved to, in sort of post the Guilmette family involvement in the brand, moved to in 2015 and lived there for 3 years before it was sold to somebody else.
Okay. And is that still a big source of fruit for you?
It is. It's in my mind, it's the best vineyard in Livermore, hands down. Okay. In terms of its ability to sort of properly ripen, especially Cab Franc, because of how cold it is, and because of the lateness of the season. Cabernet Sauvignon from there can be extraordinary if we have an earlier end to the harvest. The longer we go, and for us, that site really is kind of November. It's pretty typical to be harvesting.
Okay.
Harvested November 1st through the 3rd, I think, in 23. And that was a kind of an abrupt end to a really long and weird harvest. Great harvest in terms of quality, but just kind of strange the way it all kind of came about. But we often will be harvesting in the mid-November there. And by that time, it's cold all day long. We don't really get much more sugar accumulation when you get into November. And Cabernet Sauvignon ripens after Cab Franc. And if you're not ripe kind of then, you're not really going to get ripe. Whereas Cabernet Franc will ripen regularly from that site and produces just really beautiful, fruit-driven in a way, very acid-balanced wine. So it's a formidable place for the right kind of a grape.
Okay. What was some of the strangeness with the 23 growing season? I mean, obviously very, very cool season.
But exactly right. There was a lot of rain in the winter. We had a lot of rain in 23 in January. Reminds me of the 17 harvest, where we had a lot of rain in December of 16, and it kind of went through February, let's say, of 17. And that was ended up being a great harvest. Really kind of at that point stopped the drought, which sort of continued, unfortunately, into 18, 19, 20, up until 23. where we just got inundated with a lot of rain, which from the timing standpoint works out really well for us in that the vines are still dormant. I think the recharging of aquifers here in Livermore is helped by that rain, and it kind of helps to clean the soil out. We irrigate here in Livermore. We get water from the Delta and from other places, Hetch Hetchy, through the canals here. And irrigation water can be low in quality sometimes in terms of high percentages of dissolved solids and the like. They accumulate around the root zone of plants over time.
Interesting. Okay.
Rainwater helps to wash some of that stuff away from the roots. So there's better uptake of nutrients and all that kind of blah, blah, all that kind of, viticultural stuff. And it really was a cold year, and whites sort of started a little bit late. We caught up with reds, and then the reds just took a long time to come around, all until the sort of last couple of days of October and the first few days of November, when it all came in a rush. 2/3 of our harvest came in the 3 days.
Oh, wow.
Which for a small production team, 3 of us, my wife and son, there was a lot of work that had to be done, October 30th through November 3rd. It was an interesting, really high quality year though. Really excited about, especially given our style of wine making, which prizes acidity, high acid, wines that are a little shy at first, wines that don't have a lot of wood on them anyway. That kind of harvest, those harvest conditions work well for the style that we want to make.
Yeah, it seems like you build the wines to age and to evolve over the years, and not clobbered with oak or anything.
Absolutely. We don't want to drink. We don't like drinking a style of wine that has a lot of wood and over extraction and the like. We like wines that show the fruit, and wines that taste like what they're supposed to taste like. Cabernet Franc tastes like Cab Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon tastes like Cabernet Sauvignon. And I think the style of winemaking that prizes acid tends to produce wines that are especially age-worthy, at least as far as California is concerned. Back in the 80s and earlier, wines would be 12.5% alcohol. They might be a little bit green, which is not a style that most drinkers like these days, but it was a style of wine that aged really well, aged really long, long aging period, long graceful aging period, and made wines that ultimately 30, 40 years down the road were still drinking beautifully and were really interesting and much more delicious, than the 27 bricks style of harvest and 15% alcohol and over extraction and then over oaked.
Are you okay with a little bit of the kind of herbalness in Cabernet and Franc, I guess, specifically?
It's a good question. Interesting challenge as a winemaker. I like those wines personally. I like balanced wines. I think, all winemakers are going to say they like balanced wines, which is true, I think. Although a lot of the wines in my opinion,
where your balance
aren't
is, I guess, is different for everybody.
Exactly.
But.
how many pounds of sugar you hold in one hand versus whatever acid in the other hand. The herbal signature that Cabernet Franc especially has is something that's inherent to the grape, in my opinion. It's what differentiates Cabernet Franc from Sangiovese or Pinot Noir or Gamay or whatever other grape you might be talking about. That whole family, that Carmenet family of grapes, the Bordeaux family of grapes, all have fairly high percentages of methoxypyrazine, we call them, which is the same thing in bell peppers that give bell peppers bell pepperness, right? And the more direct sunlight that fruit gets during the growing season, the more that metabolizes out of the skins of the grapes. So if you hang Cabernet Franc a long time, if you pick it at 25 bricks or 26 or what have you, there's very little of that herbal signature left, which to me equates to a weak Cabernet Sauvignon that doesn't taste particularly good. It doesn't taste like Cabernet Franc in my mind. We want to. My goal as the person who makes picking decisions in the vineyard and who's in the vineyard the most from my team is to pick Cabernet Franc at a point where that pyrazine expression is more like smoked paprika or dried sage and bay, where it's herbal, but it's roasted or dried rather than fresh green.
Right.
And that really is it's fundamentally a function of when you pick it. If we're picking like we'd want to pick around 23 and a half bricks, 23 and a half, we get the contribution that makes, I think people say, well, that's Cab Franc, without it being real green and without it going over the edge to this abyssal kind of Cabernet Sauvignon wannabe, not tasty, not big enough for cab, kind of a horror show, to put it mildly, I suppose. So that kind of shepherding or sort of just sort of shepherding the fermentations along and having picked at the right time gives us a structure for Cabernet Franc that we like. And that herbal quality assists in helping to identify it for consumers.
You work with a few other vineyards in the Livermore area or in Livermore proper, I guess. What kind of draws you to a vineyard? What makes you want to work with it?
I think the first thing that drives that decision-making process is the relationship with the grower.
Okay.
The owner of the vineyard or the /grower. We want to work with people who are good at their jobs, and who know the site, who can help us to get to make the best possible expression from the site. So we are getting fruit, used to be getting fruit anyway from 6 different vineyards here in Livermore for Cabernet Sauvignon.
Okay.
In 23, we worked with 4 different vineyards for Cabernet Franc. We also got cab from most of those sites as well. So we have a program here where we're really focused on single vineyard expressions of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. And being able to work with these particular vineyard sites that have shown over time their quality and the dedication from the grower side of things is a great benefit to us. You're looking at the sort of general layout of the site itself. You're looking at the microclimate, as it were, how sun and wind affect the place itself. You're looking for good relationships with the people. Again, you're looking for price points. How expensive is the fruit if you're buying fruit that's not yours? We also look a lot when we're going to a new site like Bates Ranch, for instance, in the Santa Cruz Mountains, tasting wine from people from the site that people had made prior to us getting there.
Okay.
If the wines are really good, we have a lot more confidence, obviously, in the site itself. I think we're good at what we do from a winemaking standpoint, and we know that we know how to bring fruit through the winery, crush and ferment it, and age it, and how to make blends. And so, if someone else is doing the job well with fruit from a particular site, that's obviously an attractive proposition for us, assuming that, again, it's the right varietal and it's, and all of the other details line up. But the first and most important thing is the people who are involved.
Do you have any kind of inherent preference of hillside versus more valley fruit when you're looking?
There, interestingly enough, Livermore Valley is kind of a bowl-shaped valley. The valley floor here is fairly high. We're in our Stephen Kent tasting room is probably 650 feet above sea level right now, más o menos. Gilmedi gets up to about 1,000 feet at the kind of upper reaches. It's not as dramatic as Napa Valley in terms of the peaks. We don't have the Vaca range or what have you that they have in Napa, but our valley floor is higher, and so the elevation, the contribution of elevation is made in sites that are valley floor sites here that wouldn't be the same if you were going to Arroyo Seco or valley floor sites in Monterey County or Napa for that matter. I think that typically speaking, you get less fruit per acre in mountainside vineyards. There's certainly a difference in terms of productivity of the vineyard site itself from the lowest elevation of the vineyard to the upper range. So if you're on the floor of this mountain site, it's going to be a different expression of ripeness and fruit than it would be if you're on the hillside itself. We're really confident in the sites that we have chosen so far and don't really want to move outside of Livermore and the Santa Cruz Mountains, even though we've done some Napa Valley stuff. we're in the process of learning more about the Santa Cruz Mountains because the vineyards, both Bates and Zayante Vineyard, are on hillsides, especially Zayante. And you get there's seemingly a different structure to the fruit. And they both work the sort of valley floor as I would define it here in Livermore, provides a certain set of characteristics for the fruit, just as the mountainside Syrah and Merlot that we get and Cab Franc for that matter from Zayante gives us a different kind of an expression. Both are really interesting and delicious for those reasons, and both are we're finding them both to be certainly worthy and interesting enough to be in our portfolio. So I get a really long-winded answer. I don't have a preference per se. We're really more learning about the mountain sites now than we have had the opportunity to do that in the last 20 years or so.
And you still work with some of the Italian grapes also, the Barbera and
moving
Sangiovese?
away from we're still working with Sangiovese. We've made a blend called Winery, Sangiovese Cabernet blend that I think our first finish was 2000, and I think we've made it just about every year since, and are still making it. It was one of those first wines we made for our wine club. It was a really neat way of putting a wine together. I had a friend who has a restaurant in Palm Beach, Florida. And I was going out there to do a wine dinner with him, and he wanted one more red wine than we had in our portfolio at that time. And I was working on a super Tuscan style wine, Sangiovese and Cab, that we had growing from the home, what we call our home ranch, our vineyard on Tesla Road, and really liked the blend a lot. Brought the constituents in. You could actually carry it on the planes back then. So I had this box of wine with me. And I got to the restaurant about 15 minutes before the dinner started. We hurriedly put the bottles, they were all separate. So we had Cab, we had Sangiovese. Put them into a metal, a pot in the kitchen and then funneled it back into the bottles. And we had Winery from 2000. And it ended up being well received and I think a really fun wine. And Sangiovese works well here in Livermore. Different than what you get in Tuscany, in Chianti, for instance.
Sure.
But still produces a wine with great acidity and a wine that adds a lot of neat rusticity to Cabernet. We had been doing Barbera for sparkling wine up until a couple of years ago. Cabernet Franc is going to be that component now. We're going to be using Cabernet Franc for sparkling wine starting with 24 vintage.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting.
So
very cool.
We do a couple of Rhones. We do some Mourvedre and Syrah from Lodi sometimes and from the Santa Cruz Mountains. We do kind of like a winemaker selection for the year, just something we were interested in working with. Again, vineyards with stories, people who farm the vineyard really well. We want to work and do small lots of wine for folks at the tasting room while still concentrating on Cabernet Franc for the larger wholesale market.
So I grew up in Pleasanton, so I've been pretty close to Livermore Valley for a long time. But can you explain kind of Livermore to people that might not be super familiar with it?
I can do my best anyway. Magical place. Does not get the attention that it deserves in terms of wine quality, in terms of viticultural quality. Let's start there. Every place has terroir, right? The parking lot has terroir. Some places don't have good terroir. Most places don't. That identity, that idea, this term terroir, the French came up with, which sort of describes the natural characteristics of a place. The amount of sun, the amount of wind, the way the vineyards are planted, the water holding capacity, the soil content, all of these things that are viticulturally related. I tend to add winemaking into that, or at least the idea that the winemaker has about fruit as part of the terroir. Livermore has been making wine, growing fruit commercially since the 1850s, same time as Napa Valley. The first international gold medal ever given to a California wine was a Livermore Valley Sauvignon Blanc. It's Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend back in the 1880s. And this really was the first great region in California. Long before Napa became Napa, Livermore was producing significant amount of fruit, significant amounts of Sauvignon Blanc especially, Cabernet, later Chardonnay with the Wente family, Cabernet through the Concannon family and the Concannon clones of Cabernet, which really are still the bread and butter for California Cabernet from a clonal standpoint. It's a region that is unique in that it's east-west oriented from a valley standpoint. So we get wind from the Bay Area, as we kind of talked earlier, from San Francisco Bay coming through the valley to really change and extend the diurnal temperature range here. It's an interesting place in that it has been caught up in suburban growth in a way, kind of like San Jose did when my family had vineyards planted down there. Unlike Highway 29 or Silverado Trail, when you're driving in Napa, vineyards, you need to get off the freeway a couple miles before you see the vineyards in Livermore. It's an area with I think it's increasing now in a way, certainly improving, but there was a relatively low barrier to entry here for people in the wine business. Property wasn't nearly as expensive as it was in Napa. There were a lot of people who owned acreage here who were coming off of retiring from the lab, the Lawrence Livermore lab, wanted part of that wine country living experience, as it were. Started making some wine for wine clubs and friends and the like. It reminds me of an area that was sort of hidden in a way and didn't feel as if it needed to compete with the larger world of wine.
Okay.
Which I think has impeded its progress. I think that when you know that you have to compete with your neighbors, when you know you have to compete with the guy down the road, if you're one of 550 wineries in Napa, you have to compete with these folks. And if you're good, it generally forces you to be better. And if you're making wine for the wholesale channel of the business, for the larger world, if I want to make wine that people in Minnesota can get or people in New York can get, prior to the wine club revolution of the last 20 years, the only way to do that was to sell through distribution into various markets. Again, you're competing with a lot more brands that way, and you have to be better. And I think that there was I think Livermore's been a little cushy in that way. You can make your 1,000 cases of wine. You didn't have to worry about whether the guy in Napa was making 1,000 cases of wine also. You just made it, and there was enough traffic to support that kind of volume. There's not really that much enough traffic in a way to support volumes for people who want to make 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 cases of wine. You've got to be out in the larger world. You've got to be willing to throw it all out on the table and say, we deserve to be seen. We deserve to be tasted alongside whatever other name, Region X. The natural excellence that's here, the viticultural excellence that's here, allows for that kind of quality. And it saddens me when winemakers in any region, but winemakers here don't step to the plate in a way.
Okay.
Don't get the most from the fruit quality-wise that they can get. I think it's changing. I think that an emphasis on Cabernet Franc, which I suspect we'll talk more about, is, I think, opening some doors for us here.
That's a real interesting point with the size of the wineries, because you have two very large wineries in Wente and Concannon, and then a lot of fairly small.
Every other one of them, really.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing that UC Davis did a study on Livermore and the viability of viticulture in Livermore, and basically concluded that quality-wise, there's no reason why Livermore shouldn't be one of the best appellations in the state. But that the size of the brands here, the size of the wineries, Wente Concannon, Wente makes, call it 1 million cases, maybe just shy of 1 million cases. Concannon is part of the wine group, which is the third largest winery in the world, I think. So it's a small piece of a much larger pie. But there are no 30,000 case wineries in Livermore. There are there may be 1 or 2 10,000 case brands here. We're about 5,000 cases. Our goal is to get to 10,000 cases of Cab Franc in the next 5 years, let's say. There are 2,500 acres of fruit planted in Livermore, roughly. Compare that to 50,000 acres planted in Napa Valley. You can kind of see how small we are compared to other regions. If you take Concannon and take Wente out of the equation, all of the other wineries in the valley can subsist on about 300 acres worth of fruit.
Wow.
Which means that, if we all went away, it wouldn't change the equation for Wente and Concannon much in terms of the amount of land that's needed for fruit. However, a lot of the vineyards planted here were planted 20 years ago. They're coming up on kind of the sort of accepted commercial extent of their viability. Replanting needs to happen here. Investment needs to happen here. That needs to be led by wineries making quality wine and making enough of it to support another 2,500 acres, to make this a real viable wine region. So there's a lot of interesting challenges. Infrastructure challenges, viticultural infrastructure challenges in Livermore.
It seems like you think Cab Franc is kind of one of the ways forward out of that, right? Like a signature grape that Livermore can put out there?
Absolutely. I don't know how many years I have left, but they're all going to be devoted to that idea that the wine regions that we all know about, even people who don't drink a lot of wine, they know Napa, they know Sonoma probably, they certainly know Bordeaux, they know Champagne, they know Burgundy, they know Chianti. Those are all areas that are defined historically by one or two or a few grapes. My belief is that if Livermore, the way for Livermore to become a more visible and more vibrant and more sustainable area is to be identified by a variety, by a single grape in our case. If you go to Paso Robles, it's their own varieties. If you go to Napa, it's Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Franc, which in my mind is the sexiest, most alluring, most delicious, most food-friendly grape wine out there, isn't owned by any other region. It's a world-class variety. It's part of some of the most expensive wines made in the world. It grows extremely well in Livermore. Half the wineries here are already making Cab Franc. That seems to me to be the right choice from a viticultural standpoint, from a marketing and sales standpoint, not to say anything at all about the aesthetic side of things, which is just, it's dramatically great as a variety, making extraordinarily expressive, meaningful, emotionally connective wine. And I really believe that we can thrive as a region, even a small region, if we focus on that particular grape as the calling card for our region. And so I'm doing all that I can in a number of different ways to try to make that happen.
I want to ask you about, you have the Mount Diablo Highlands Wine Quality Alliance, which is kind of an aspect of that, right?
Absolutely.
That's kind of a tasting panel, almost like kind of a French appellation tasting type panel, or what's it involved in exactly?
That's a good question. So I was one of the founders of the Quality Alliance, Wine Quality. We call it the Wine Quality Alliance now. And the idea was to try to create some rigor from a winemaking standpoint, from an evaluation standpoint of our wines, to try to look at our winemaking and grape growing here in a quality umbrella by saying, the winemakers here are working together. They are looking at wines from a technical standpoint and then from a qualitative standpoint in terms of how Cabernet, does this Cabernet Franc taste like Cabernet Franc? Does this Cab taste like Cab? Does this Merlot taste like Merlot? And working together to improve quality in the vineyard and in the winery, helping younger winemakers, new wineries to make better and better wine, knowing that, especially with a winery where there's only 35 or 40 wineries that are kind of active in making wine, that if you have a few wineries that are not doing a good job, it really pulls down the rest of the appellation. There's bad wine being made in a lot of places. But if you have 500 wineries, a few of them not making good wine doesn't really reflect on anybody's sense of what that region can be like quality-wise, like Napa, for instance. We stood the Wine Quality Alliance up a couple of years ago. The Tri-Valley Conservancy has been absolutely instrumental in providing funding to hire a consulting winemaker, a really talented winemaker named Julie Schreiber, who works with wineries all throughout the year, but especially during harvest and fermentation to help increase quality. She does seminars and tastings that are about, for instance, sanitation in the winery.
Okay.
How do you do that better and better? How do you grow better fruit in the vineyards? There's a lot of sharing from the wineries that are members of the alliance, as it were, tasting a lot together blind, evaluating the wines in an honest fashion so people get really good feedback. It's not a beauty contest. It's sort of, hey, I'm bringing this wine because I have an issue with it. Tell me what you think and how might I improve the quality. Okay. And it's a neat process because it really requires you to be honest with yourself and honest with the rest of Livermore about what it is you're doing. And if you're open to improvement and you're open to that kind of help, then you will end up making better wine and the valley will benefit. Every that rising tide of quality lifts all of the ships here. So that process has been really interesting to be part of. I'm on the board of the Quality Alliance, and I think that its importance is going to be seen when we kind of evolve into that sort of certification model that we had in mind, that kind of appellation imprimatur sort of thing, however that might be represented by a sticker on the bottle or however, where we say as a region, hey, we're different than other places. We're not just going to say we make great wine. We're going to put our wines through this process of evaluation that is not only, hey, you don't have Brett, you don't have VA problems, you don't have there's no technical faults in the wine. But also you're making wines that really are Livermore Valley in style, whatever that happens to mean. And put that out for lovers of Livermore Valley wine or people who will become lovers of Livermore wine and put our money where our mouth is in terms of quality and really look at that as a way to help tell a story about Livermore that you don't get from other regions. That at least from a U.S. standpoint. As you mentioned, you get that from Canadian provinces and you get that from European appellations, that there's a certain level of quality that has to be there in order for you to get appellation status.
Right. It's a real interesting idea. Seems like a great step for Livermore just to get the quality at a certain level, because like you said, with only 35 or 40 wineries, you get 3 or 4 that aren't quite up to it and you're at 10%.
Exactly.
It adds up quick.
The worst thing that can come from something like this would be that a lot of information gets shared, a lot of good information, good technical information. We get a lot more viewpoints as a winemaker about what quality actually means. One of my impulses has always been to try to bring wines from outside the region for people to taste. Cab Franc, for instance, let's say, from the Loire Valley, from Bulgari, from places in the Finger Lakes, and Cab Franc-Kapalooza is something that does this in a very definite way. But the idea being that until winemakers know what quality is and know it objectively, not just from points necessarily in a magazine, although that could be a good starting point, for instance, until you know what those quality levels are, you're fooling yourself or you're concluding something about your own wines without enough evidence, right? Without enough context. Everybody thinks their baby is beautiful. Right. But until you put your baby in the contest with all the other beautiful babies, you don't really know how beautiful your baby is. And being able to be honest about that and seeking that kind of knowledge by tasting as widely as you can, variety to variety, region to region. You're not delusional exactly, but you're also not giving yourself the best opportunity for success.
There was a study done recently also kind of breaking Livermore Valley into some more sub-AVAs also, right?
There was, and something that Stephen Kent Winery is definitely moving forward with from an idea standpoint and a communication standpoint. The state of California, one of the, I can't remember exactly what organization it was or what department of agriculture it was that did this study, looked at Livermore Valley's topography, looked at its soils, looked at its elevation changes, looked at the natural environment of Livermore Valley, and concluded that there were 12 distinct areas, 12 distinct districts that taken individually would provide fruit that was different from district to district. So if you planted Cabernet Franc in every one of these districts and you made the wines the same way in the winery, so you took out the winemaking as a variable, you'd expect to get 12 very distinct and distinctive Cabernet Francs. This is not a new notion, obviously. There are, I don't know how many, 18 sub-appellations in Napa Valley or whatever it is. There's a lot of sub-appellations in Lodi, in Paso Robles. Livermore is a one appellation town at this point in time, one appellation area, and it deserves to be, in my mind, deserves is the wrong word. It ought to be characterized more specifically because it is very variable. There's, I think, 90,000 acres of plantable, 90,000 acres within the appellation boundaries.
Okay.
Again, only 2,500 of which are planted at this point in time. There's very little planted north of 580, the freeway.
Right.
The northern boundary of the appellation is the summit of Mount Diablo. There's nothing really planted outside of some home vineyards, very small acreage from that point south into Livermore Valley. And I think that from both perspectives, the perspective of the consumer wanting wine from the most specific place possible, from the lieu dit or from the single vineyard, is one direction. And the other direction would be from the winemakers who were trying to explore and get all from Livermore Valley that it can get. Being able to have an organized way for that to be presented legally by having a sub-appellation in this case is valuable for everybody involved. The districts in that study, I think, are just the starting point. There's nothing that's binding about those. They're an idea at this point in time. There would need to be work done, and I intend to be part of it at some point in time, that would bring the idea of the Tesla district or the Altamont district or the Mendenhall district to life as sub-appellations. Whether they're called those things exactly, who knows at this point. But and we work with vineyards in several of these districts, and they are very different. Gilmette is very different than vineyards over on the Pleasanton Livermore border. And those differences should be prized, I think, by winemakers and by consumers. So the idea of what this study showed us is that there is this differentiation, that there really is something that's not just a marketing pitch. And the idea of the Mount Diablo Highlands as an appellation, it has been met with non-universal acclaim, let's put it. There's a lack of unanimity about that aspect of things, but that's an interesting development, or will be an interesting development down the road, I think.
So Cab Franc as a red grape, and then obviously like Winty with Chardonnay, but then Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon have super long history, Wetmore and Cresta Blanca and everything. Is there a white grape that you feel like is the proper grape for Livermore to hang its hat on?
You know, I think that Sauvignon Blanc should be that variety. We used to make Sauvignon Blanc. I don't drink a lot of Sauvignon Blanc, and I probably wouldn't make it even if it kind of were a valley-wide effort to promote the variety. There are a number of winemakers here who think that should be a grape that we explore. And historically, it's probably the most important variety in Livermore in certain ways. You take out Chardonnay, the Winty family has pioneered, very important. Most of what they do now is Monterey County. And I think the fruit grows better there than Livermore anyway, just given temperatures and the like. Cabernet, different story. Cabernet historically great from Livermore, continues to be great from Livermore, and has helped seed, as I said before, 70% of the cab being grown in California. Sauvignon Blanc is getting great acceptance in the marketplace these days. People like Sauvignon Blanc, and there's not enough fruit to go around, it seems, at least through the 23 harvest. I think that there's certainly room to have a white and a red component in a valley. I think that anytime you add something else to the pie, you start bifurcating the message.
Okay.
And you start reducing the amount of time that can be spent on a podcast like this, or talking with somebody, a wine writer, or somebody at a store who's looking to buy your wine. You take focus away from things. So, if you have one thing to talk about, that's 100% of your time, right? You have two things now, it's 50%, three things, So from the standpoint of being focused from a message idea, and from the standpoint of being focused on really getting our arms around what it means to grow Cabernet Franc, for instance, here, the fewer number of grapes that are being sort of thrown out there as the Livermore variety, I think the better off we all are. That doesn't mean at all that we shouldn't be making really cool stuff from other grapes. It just means that if you're talking about Cabernet Franc and you can say to somebody, the best Cabernet Franc is from the Livermore Valley, you should go there and taste the 50 Cab Francs you can find at Livermore. You're also going to get great Cab. You're also going to get great Merlot, or whatever else we grow here. And we can grow a lot of things well. I think there is no tagline that says, hey, we grow everything pretty well.
Yeah.
That's not a message that is successful anyway. And so I'm not against it all Sauvignon Blanc, for instance. I just think the more you do, the less you get.
Yeah.
In this case.
Yeah. I've always really liked the Petit Syrah from Livermore. I think that's a grape that a lot of people have done well here over the years.
I've had this discussion interestingly enough, I guess the idea of Cab Franc and my evangelizing it is getting beyond just my own head and the people in the room with me. Because I've had this discussion with a number of people. And again, I love the history of regions. I love the history of the Livermore Valley. The Concanon's first varietally labeled Petit Syrah in 1961. It can make interesting wine. I don't think Petit Syrah is world class. I think there are better Petit Syrahs than some are better than others. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I don't think, even though it's been growing here for a long time, I don't think it tells a story that's nearly as interesting as the Cabernet Franc story.
Sure. Yeah.
In the palate, on the paper, however you want to talk about it. I would love to taste someone's really good Petit Syrah. But from a regional standpoint, I don't think that there's enough. Cabernet Franc is the sixth most widely planted variety in France. There are tens of thousands of hectares devoted to Cab Franc in France. And has historically been part of some of the most expensive wines that there are. And yet it's not known by the vast majority of U.S. wine drinkers. And if it's known as a blending grape. Petit Syrah, while more widely planted and more tonnage being grown every year than Cab Franc in California at the moment, is much further down the totem pole, as it were, from a recognition standpoint than Cabernet Franc is. And again, so regional history, fantastic. Pinning your hopes as a region on Petit Syrah compared to Cabernet Franc just doesn't seem like it has the same potential for success.
Oh yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. I think it grows I think Livermore grows and makes it well, but I agree with you there. Yeah. That Cabernet Franc is much more likely to get that message out, and it's got some bigger shoulders to stand on, I think, for the region.
Agreed. And I think that there's certain regions like the, Amador and the foothills, and there are a couple of Napa brands that make Petit Syrah as well. We're not just looking at Livermore Valley when we talk about Cab Franc. I'm not. I think that the most important aspect to start with this process. And if I'm looking 30 years down the road, I'm seeing people, hey, you know what? Cab Franc from Livermore that's the best place to go. Hopefully it doesn't take longer than that. We at least at the same time as we're trying to promote Stephen Kent Cab Franc, Livermore Valley Cab Franc, we have to build brand Cab Franc, right? I mean, that if you only have a small population who knows what this thing is, and you're catering only to that small population, the chance of it growing into something larger and more self-sustaining is less than if you were to look at Cab Franc as a whole in California, in the US, in the world, and say, my job is to educate people or to reveal to people, however you want to say it, about how great Cab Franc is, how delicious it is with food, how wonderful it is as a variety, where it grows well, all of these kinds of fundamental things. And then I can move people in a general way, move consumers, move wine lovers through this kind of funnel, as it were, to, okay, you've demonstrated that you love Cab Franc. We know that now. Have you had Cab Franc from California? Have you had Cab Franc from the Finger Lakes? Have you had Cab Franc from Texas, from wherever else you might get it? You have. Have you been to Livermore Valley? There seems to be a natural progression as to how this message gets promulgated and how the idea of Cab Franc as a thing grows. I don't think you start from the bottom up. I think you have to start from the top down in a way. 30 years is not a long time in the wine business. 30 years, hopefully, is minimum of what I have left to devote to this. So we have to talk about Stephen Kent Cab Franc, obviously, and Livermore Cab Franc too. But a lot of the effort, from my perspective, is going toward the promulgation of brand Cab Franc, just like Oregon had brand Oregon 25 years ago. When no one knew what Oregon Pinot Noir was, you first had to let people know that there was an Oregon from which great fruit could come. And then it's easier to communicate the idea that it's Pinot Noir that's actually great in Oregon, and Oregon Pinot Noir may be better than California Pinot Noir, or what have you. But you have to, I think, start from the foundation of the thing itself, and then get more specific as you go along, as you start getting more traction about the idea of Cab Franc in general.
Would you want to tell me a little bit about the different lines you have? You have the Entrecote and Stephen Kent, obviously, and then your lineage wines also.
Probably one of the many mistakes that I made was creating sub-brands and moving the focus away from Stephen Kent as a thing. L'Entrecote was, so past tense now.
Okay.
L'Entrecote is and L'Entrecote was. We, for a number of different reasons, most of which need a psychiatrist, I think, to fully uncover. I've always felt like when we were making a focus on a brand, making a focus on a variety, let's say, or making a focus of a specific wine that was different than the majority of what we were making, that our story was better told by creating a brand around it, rather than having been a part of a larger portfolio. L'Entrecote was made in 2017. We came up with the idea of L'Entrecote as a way of defining and sort of circumscribing our Cabernet Franc effort. L'Entrecote means the other shore. It was kind of this sort of phrase in my mind that denoted, anyway, this idea of the right bank, the other coast, the other shore, as a way of obliquely pointing to Cabernet Franc. And in typical Stephen Mirassou fashion, it's a grouping of words that people have a harder time to pronounce than they might if it were in English, for instance. And so in thinking about this over the last couple of years, decided that L'Autre-Côte will end up being the name of a single wine, which will be a Cab Franc heavy Merlot Cab blend. Cab Franc Merlot Cab. It'll be sort of the bookend to Lineage, which was maybe the first time we kind of split from Stephen Kent in a way. Lineage was a left bank Cabernet Sauvignon heavy brand wine that was significantly more expensive and had maybe higher aspirations than the typical Stephen Kent wine had. But again, took the focus away from what we're called, who we are, how people know us. And Lineage is going to stay Lineage. It's one wine. L'Autre-Côte will stay L'Autre-Côte, one wine. Cabernet Franc from the Stephen Kent Winery is how every other thing that we make Cabernet Franc, or every other Cabernet Franc release, whether it's Cabernet Franc Blanc or Rosé or sparkling wine or single vineyard Bates Ranch, Zayante, any number of Livermore wineries, Livermore vineyards, all of those are Cabernet Franc by the Stephen Kent Winery and will be identified on the back label with the vineyard name. And so the idea now is to get away from the idea of a collection of brands and back to the idea of the Stephen Kent Winery focuses the majority of its attention and all of its attention in the wholesale end of things on Cabernet Franc. You come to the taste room, you can taste a lot of really cool things that are made in such small volume. They don't go anywhere but here. And we love doing that. We're winemakers, like making things. And we get very excited about new things. And our club members and our guests here are wonderful guinea pigs in a way. They give us a lot of great feedback about whether they like the things that we're trying to give them, the new experiences that we're trying to create for them. And it's a really fun, synergistic relationship. But in terms of how Stephen Kent will be seen down the road, it's going to be Stephen Kent. And then the varietal focus underneath it will be Cab Franc.
That's great. So you have the seventh generation in the family
Very
business.
Exciting. Very exciting.
Right?
So my son Aiden is the 1/3 of our production team. So my wife Beth and I and Aiden are the three people who make our wines. And then my daughter Sarah my youngest daughter Sarah is going to be our wine club manager. She's moving full-time into the business in the next couple of months. She's nannying her oldest sister's kids full-time also, but she will be the front-facing person here in the tasting room for the most part. That's family. Beth and I and Aiden spend a lot of time here as well. We love talking to the people who love our wines. And but the seventh generation, we're the oldest winemaking family in the country. We started 6 years before Abraham Lincoln was president and have sort of seen just about everything you can see in the business. And I'm proud of that. I'm excited about the future. I'm excited about being able to create a foundation, frankly, a financial foundation for the company that allows for the eighth generation, my grandkids and their kids and on and on and on. I'd love to be like the Antinoris and the longtime French families that have been there for 18 generations.
Yeah,
that would be the ultimate goal. But having younger people involved always means more energy and means newer ideas and means hopefully a conduit to an audience that's not represented well by the business, and an audience from an age standpoint that is certainly going to be the most important, if they're not already, the most important part of the wine world for wineries. And knowing how to talk to that group, knowing what's important to them, which is different than what was important to their parents, I think is more naturally and authentically gained and communicated when you have people of that age group talking to them as well. Sure. So that from that perspective, it makes all the sense in the world too.
How did so I wanted to know how the original book came about, the Lineage book, but then also you have a new book you're noodling away on. I didn't think so. I carry a notebook in my back pocket and I write down stuff, observations, things to think about. And
remember, God, going back to well before college and certainly in graduate school when I was alone in a little apartment in New York and a little typewriter I bought and would type stuff before personal computers were around, and collected, what ended up being about 15,000 words, let's say, pre-pandemic. And I showed my father this because a lot of it was family history. It was sort of the history of the Mirassou family, and became a part of the first book. And I didn't know this. I didn't know he was going to do this, but he gave this these scribbles, this collection of words, to a friend who passed it on to a friend who was a publisher.
Okay.
A guy named Paul Chutko, who's a friend now, but owns a small little publishing house in Napa. And I got an email out of the blue from him. I didn't know who he was. He said, someone shared this with me, and I think it's beautiful. And if you ever finish it, I'd love to publish it. And this was right as the pandemic was hitting. Okay. This was like November of 2019. And I didn't think when I was in graduate school, that was a goal, was to write books, write fiction at that point in time. And I didn't think that was going to happen at this point in time. I was 30 years older and we're trying to run a business and trying to, my creativity, as it were, was expressed through wine for the most part. Or at least the business gave me that opportunity. But there was a lot of sort of space around people during the pandemic, and I would go into my office at night and I would just write. And the book came out in 2021, and it was really sort of became a history of Livermore Valley wine, a history of the Mirassou family. I hope gives people a real idea of what it's like to be to be a winemaker, to be in a winery in the middle of the harvest, to be in the vineyard at the middle, in the middle of night when fruit's about to be picked, what it's like to blend wine, what wine means, which was my goal. And the first book did well. People liked it, I think, and has led me to the idea of writing more specifically about Cabernet Franc. And Cabernet Franc, not in a textbook sort of way, but in a way that corresponds. I think I came up with a title that works, and it's really kind of one winemaking's family. What Cabernet Franc means, or what does Cabernet Franc mean? ? One winemaking family's quest to answer the question. And so it's really an idea to talk about, the everyday life again of kind of what it means to be making wine, but what it means to be making wine in the context of a single grape, and what that means in terms of how one looks at the business of wine, but also how one defines the aesthetic enjoyment of it, and what this particular variety means in terms of its historical importance, its importance in terms of blends and the like, but really more, I think, even more fundamentally about what it means in terms of its contribution to the emotional growth of wine lovers. And I use Cabernet Franc as the synecdoche key for all other varieties, I think. But it is this idea that, wine should be, in my opinion, an important part of any well-lived life, and can be an important part of any well-lived life. And that if one tends to think about these kinds of things, these aesthetic things like books, like wine, like art, like movies, in an emotional way, wine certainly can play that role as well. So that's kind of what this exploration is about. Okay. And hopefully I'll be done in about 6 months or so. Okay. That's a long elevator pitch right there. Still refining.
Yeah, of course. And then you do some writing on Substack, and you have a podcast also.
I do. Yeah. Wine Saves Lives is my Substack, and kind of is my website, winesaveslives.com. And again, this idea that wine can be an emotional part of a person's life. And I love to communicate in a variety of different ways. And I'm always thinking about, how do I communicate this idea about that emotional connection, but also just about Cab Franc in particular, and about the Mirassou family in particular, about our involvement in this business for 170 years. And the Substack offers an interesting way to provide that information and sort of have that kind of second career, as it were, that I thought I might have when I was 22. So it's a lot of work, but also I think something I want to be as representative of me at the end of the day as the winemaking is.
Yeah, it's great. You get to chance to use the degree and another creative outlet also.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Words are powerful. Images are powerful, obviously. And I've written about and always regarded wine as being a bottomless thing. You never get to the end of what it is and what it means and how it tastes and how it changes over time. And it also is a bottomless well for storytelling and for revealing a variety of different things. So it's a great symbol as well as a great something to drink. That provides just easy comfort, which is an important thing, especially these days, but much deeper succor as well to that chase for an emotional life and that chase for emotional connection.
Mm-hmm. What's the best way for people to follow Stephen Kent Winery or get some of the wines?
Thank you for asking. I appreciate that. Our tasting room is open on Vasco Road Thursday through Sunday from 12 to 5. And we have a club member lounge that we do a lot of really fun tasting in. We have a beautiful sort of main tasting area, and when it stops raining finally in the springtime, our patio will be open as well. So we love for people to come here. We have a great collection of really great wine representatives, friends who love wine, and I think do a great job of just sort of giving people an opportunity of saying yes to our wines. In terms of how to connect with me, winesaveslives.com, winesaveslives.substack.com are ways of and on Instagram and various other things. I just started a TikTok channel the other day and doing really very short videos specifically about Cab Franc again. I like the idea of trying to communicate with people and with different age demographics and the like. So it's interesting to use tools that are out there to tell that story. Mm-hmm. And so I'm doing a number. You can find me in a lot of different places.
That's great.
I've had a lot of fun with this. I would just maybe say one more thing. The Livermore Valley wine community has a rich history, and that history, I think, informs its potential in the future. And I think that there are a number of wine brands that have next generation kids involved, which makes this a more and more exciting place all the time. And I think that wine lovers owe themselves a trip out here. It's the closest wine region to 6 million people in the Bay Area. Practically every place you go, you're going to be met by really, really nice people and people who care a lot about what it is that they're doing, care a lot about Livermore Valley. And I think that you'll end up with a really rewarding experience and some great wine at a price point that makes it much more palatable than folks up north might be charging. So I really recommend people come and see us at our wineries. I think you'll fall in love with the place and want to come back again and again.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that, not to take any business away from Stephen Kent, but there are another 5, 6 wineries within tasting rooms within walking distance of you.
Absolutely within walking distance. If anyone's been to Paso Robles out there and been to Tin City, it's a really cool spot. And I think it started really as like an industrial area that people were made wine in and has grown into this hospitality hub, food hub, wine hub. Vasco Row is this area on Vasco and Research. That's kind of the intersection. There are 7 wineries. There's a There are 2 breweries within walking distance. There's a speakeasy across the street making great spirits. Dave Hendrickson, who makes wine next door to Ocasio, does the spirit making. He's a great distiller, really talented guy. This is a growing area, and I think this area will hopefully, and I know the city of Livermore sees it the same way, will grow into a spot. It'll grow into the spot in the Livermore Valley where you can go to get great wine, great food, great hospitality experiences. Will kind of be the other side of the other boundary where you have downtown, where you have First Street and Livermore Avenue, and then you've got Vasco Row as another boundary for great entertainment options in the valley. So it's an exciting place to be.
Thanks for listening today to my conversation with Stephen. He's doing really great things in Livermore and trying to bring it back to the forefront of California wine regions. It has as long of a history with high-quality wines as just about anywhere. We'll dive into that some more in an upcoming episode. You can find the Stephen Kent wines at stephenkent.com and follow them on Instagram at SK Winery. The tasting room on Vasco Road is a great place to track down the wines also. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too, even just one, and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too, of course. There's also a Patreon to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.